Picture a photograph, black and white, slightly faded. 6 young men in white shirts, all fit, all smiling, looking into the camera the way people look when they know the greatest adventure in human history is waiting for them. It's 1960. Any one of these 6 men could have become the first human in space. Only one of them flew. And here's the part that really gets you. One of the men in this photo will die under the wheels of a train a few years later, and to this day no one knows for certain whether it was an accident. Another will die during a training exercise, 20 days before Gagarin's flight, in a horrific fire that will be officially covered up for the next 20 years. 2 more will simply vanish from the pages of history, as if they had never existed at all. We tend to remember the space race as a story with one hero. One rocket, one flag planted first, one name every schoolchild can recite. But that single name was chosen out of a small crowd of equally capable, equally brave men. And the ones who weren't chosen didn't just go home disappointed. Some of them paid with their health. One paid with his life within weeks. And at least one, according to many who've studied this story, may have paid with his life years later, in circumstances that still don't fully add up. Today we're telling the story of men chosen by fate and then forgotten by it. The backups who stood behind Gagarin, and the price the Soviet space program paid, quietly and off the record, for its greatest public triumph. In the autumn of 1959, a secret operation began across the entire Soviet Union. Special commissions traveled between military airfields, quietly combing through the personnel files of fighter pilots. At first, none of the candidates knew why they were being called in for these strange interviews, or why doctors were suddenly examining their health with such obsessive, almost paranoid care. Some of them assumed they were being scouted for a new experimental aircraft program. A few guessed something bigger was happening, but nobody dared say the word space out loud. The criteria were almost absurdly strict. Under 30 years old, no taller than 170 centimeters, no heavier than 70 kilograms, all because of the cramped, tiny cabin of the future spacecraft, which had been designed with almost no room to spare. But height and weight were only the first filter. Health was the real gatekeeper. The medical board disqualified candidates for the smallest imperfections, an old appendix scar, a faint and clinically meaningless heart murmur, even posture that wasn't quite textbook. Men who had flown supersonic jets in combat conditions were rejected over paperwork-thin medical technicalities. Out of thousands of pilots screened across the country, only 20 made it through this brutal filtering process. It's worth pausing on that number because it tells you something important. These weren't necessarily the Soviet Union's most talented pilots, the ones who distinguished themselves in the air. They were, more than anything, the healthiest young men who happened to already be in aviation. Skill mattered. But in this particular selection, a perfect blood pressure reading could outweigh years of flying experience. On March 7, 1960, 12 of these 20 men were officially enrolled in what would become known as the first Cosmonaut Squad. A few more names were added over the following months, bringing the group to 20 in total. They moved to a closed military settlement outside Moscow, a place with no name on any public map, later known as Star City, and began a training regimen unlike anything that had existed before, because nothing like it had ever been needed before. Among them were names the whole world would soon know: Yuri Gagarin, German Titov, Andrei Nikolaev, Pavel Popovich, Valery Bykovsky, Alexei Leonov. But there were others too, names that meant just as much at the time: Valentin Varlamov, Anatoly Kardashev, Grigory Nelyubov, Valentin Bondarenko, Ivan Anikiev, Mars Rafikov, Valentin Filatiev, Dmitry Zykin. On paper, in the spring of 1960, all 20 of these men had roughly equal chances. Nobody, including the men themselves, knew who would end up making history and who would end up as a footnote. The world would remember 12 out of 20. The rest would become something closer to ghosts of Soviet cosmonautics. Men whose names were quietly airbrushed out of official photographs, deleted from published lists, and buried in classified documents for decades, as if the state itself had decided that only winners were allowed to have existed at all. In the summer of 1960, 6 men were singled out from the 20 candidates for a special, more intensive program. Those who began direct, focused training for the first human spaceflight. This is the same 6 we see in the photograph from the start of this video: Gagarin, Titov, Nikolaev, Popovich, and 2 names known today mostly to space historians and dedicated enthusiasts of the subject: Anatoly Kardashev and Valentin Varlamov. At the time, nobody would have guessed that these last 2 names would fade into obscurity. Kardashev, in particular, was considered one of the physically strongest and most robust men in the entire squad, the kind of pilot instructors pointed to as an example of peak condition. But space, as it turned out, wasn't testing strength in any conventional sense. It was testing the limits of the human body in ways nobody on Earth fully understood yet, because nobody on Earth had ever needed to know them before. One of the most punishing trials was the centrifuge, a machine that spun the cosmonauts in a small capsule at the end of a long arm, subjecting their bodies to forces far beyond anything experienced in normal flight. During these tests, the men were pushed to accelerations 8 times the force of Earth's gravity, simulating the brutal strain of a rocket launch and the stress of atmospheric re-entry. Cosmonauts described the sensation as an invisible weight crushing their chest, making it almost impossible to breathe, while their vision narrowed and darkened at the edges. After one such session, doctors examining Kardashev found something alarming. Bruising spread across his back, a pattern of multiple pinpoint capillary ruptures where blood vessels beneath the skin had simply burst under the pressure. His body, for all its outward strength, had a physical limit that the centrifuge had found and crossed. The 28-year-old pilot's health couldn't withstand the strain that the mission demanded, and he was quietly removed from flight training, his file closed, his name set aside. The second man in the 6, Valentin Varlamov, was undone not by a machine at all, but by an ordinary day off, the kind of afternoon any of the men might have spent relaxing before the next round of grueling exercises. Swimming in a lake outside Moscow with fellow trainees, he dove into water that turned out to be shallower than he expected, and the impact fractured a vertebra in his neck. It wasn't a training accident, wasn't a system failure, wasn't anyone's fault in any dramatic sense, just an ordinary, everyday kind of misfortune. But a spinal injury of that kind was enough. A cosmonaut's career had ended in an instant, before it had even truly begun, on a summer afternoon that was supposed to be nothing more than a break from the pressure. It might look, from a distance, like simple bad luck, the sort of thing that could happen to anyone, in any profession. But think about it this way. The fate of who would become the first human being to leave the Earth's atmosphere wasn't decided by some grand strategic decision handed down by the Communist Party or by a careful, deliberate weighing of talent and character. It came down to whether someone's back could survive a few minutes on a spinning machine, or whether someone dove safely into a lake on an otherwise unremarkable day off. The entire course of human history, the name school children would memorize for generations. could have gone in an entirely different direction because of bruises on one pilot's back or a few centimeters of water depth on an ordinary afternoon. In place of Kardashev and Varlamov, two other men were brought into the final six to keep the group at full strength: Grigory Nelyubov and Valery Bykovsky. Bykovsky would go on to fly into space himself years later. Nelyubov would not. And it's Nelyubov's story that becomes, without question, the most tragic one in this entire account. While Kardashev and Varlamov were eliminated relatively early, before the truly final selection, Grigory Nelyubov made it much, much further than either of them. Further, in fact, than almost anyone in the squad except Gagarin and Titov themselves. Just days before the scheduled flight, the state commission overseeing the program narrowed the entire field down to a final trio of finalists: Yuri Gagarin, German Titov, and Grigory Nelyubov. One of these three men would fly first and become immortal. One would be the official backup, ready to step in at a moment's notice. And one would be the second-string candidate, held in reserve for a future mission. By every account from people who trained alongside him, Nelyubov was considered one of the most capable, confident, and naturally gifted men in the entire squad. Sharp, quick-witted, physically strong, and openly, visibly ambitious about his future. He didn't hide the fact that he expected to succeed. Colleagues remembered him as someone who spoke with the easy self-assurance of a man who already saw himself as a future hero of the Soviet Union. So when the commission finally announced its decision, Gagarin flies first, Titov serves as backup, and Nelyubov remains only the reserve third candidate. It landed on him like a physical blow, according to those who were there to see his reaction. On April 12, 1961, the whole world learned Yuri Gagarin's name within hours of his landing. Radio broadcasts across the globe repeated it. Newspapers ran it in massive headlines the very next morning. Nobody, anywhere, learned about Grigory Nelyubov, the man who had stood just steps away from that very spacecraft on the morning of the launch, fully trained, fully prepared, and fully capable of making that same flight himself if history had shuffled its cards just slightly differently. He kept training after that, still holding on to a genuine hope for the next flight, still telling himself and others that his turn would come soon. He continued to be considered, at least on paper, a serious candidate for future missions. But space never called for him again. Flight after flight was assigned instead to other men, some of whom had joined the training group considerably later than he had, men he had once outranked in ability and readiness. In 1963, an incident occurred that put a final, irreversible end to Nelyubov's career. Together with two other squad members, Ivan Anikiev and Valentin Filatiev, he got into a heated confrontation with a military patrol while off base, reportedly after the three of them had been drinking. It was the kind of episode that, in almost any ordinary military posting, might have resulted in a formal reprimand and nothing more. But for a cosmonaut, a man whose entire public identity was meant to embody Soviet discipline, sobriety, and moral perfection, it was treated as a fundamentally different kind of offense. All three men were quietly expelled from the squad. Their cosmonaut careers ended not by a medical board or a centrifuge, but by a single bad night. Picture it for a moment, and really sit with it. A man who had stood one single step away from becoming the second human being in space. A man who had trained for years, endured the same brutal centrifuge and isolation chambers as Gagarin himself, ends up reassigned as an ordinary pilot in some forgettable provincial unit, with no public gratitude for his years of service, no ceremony, no recognition of any kind, and, crucially, no right to ever tell anyone just how close he had actually come to making history. Nelyubov struggled, by every account, to come to terms with this fall from grace. According to people who knew him in those later years, he never fully accepted being denied the recognition and the future he genuinely believed he had earned through years of preparation and sacrifice. He began drinking heavily. He clashed repeatedly with the people around him. He wrote letter after letter to his former commanders, begging to be reinstated into the squad, insisting he still had a role to play. Letters that went, as far as anyone knows, entirely unanswered. On February 27, 1966, Grigory Nelyubov was found dead on railway tracks near the remote station where he was then serving. The official record calls it an accident, a man struck by a train, nothing more, nothing to investigate further. But the exact circumstances of his death still raise real questions among space history researchers to this day, questions that have never been fully resolved. Was it truly just an accident? Or did a man who had spent years quietly being erased from the official record of Soviet cosmonautics, piece by piece, finally succumb to that erasure in the most permanent way possible? And about that erasure, it isn't just a figure of speech, and it isn't exaggeration for dramatic effect. In the famous, widely published photographs of the first cosmonaut squad that appeared throughout the Soviet press, Grigory Nelyubov's face was literally retouched out and physically removed after his expulsion, using the same kind of photo manipulation the regime used to erase other people who had fallen out of favor. A man who came within one decision of becoming the second human being to leave planet Earth officially ceased to exist in the public record while he was still very much alive to see it happen. If Nelyubov's story is a slow, grinding tragedy of gradual erasure, Valentin Bondarenko's story ended instantly, violently, and almost unbearably. Bondarenko was the youngest member of the entire first squad, just 24 years old, a young man still near the very beginning of what should have been a long and celebrated career. On March 23, 1961, exactly 20 days before Gagarin's flight would make history, Bondarenko was undergoing a routine, entirely ordinary training session inside an isolation chamber. A small, sealed capsule designed to help cosmonauts adjust to the prolonged solitude, silence, and sensory deprivation that awaited them during actual spaceflight. The chamber, like the spacecraft it was meant to simulate, maintained an atmosphere artificially enriched with oxygen, matching the environment planned for future missions. After finishing his exercise for the day, Bondarenko did something almost unthinkably small and ordinary. He wiped his skin with a cotton swab soaked in medical alcohol to clean off sensor adhesive, and then tossed the used swab aside without thinking twice about it. It landed, as it tragically turned out, right next to a hot electric heating plate used to regulate the chamber's temperature. In that oxygen-saturated atmosphere, far richer in oxygen than the normal air we breathe, the fire didn't just start. It exploded into being almost instantly, spreading with a speed and ferocity that would have been impossible in ordinary air. By the time ground personnel managed to get the sealed hatch of the capsule open, a process that took long, agonizing minutes, because the air pressure inside and outside the chamber had to be carefully equalized first, or opening it too quickly could have caused its own catastrophic failure. Bondarenko had suffered severe burns across nearly the entirety of his body. He was still conscious when they pulled him out, and by some accounts, his first words were an apology, worried that he'd be blamed for the fire and would lose his place in the program. He died later that same day in the hospital, surrounded by doctors who could do almost nothing for injuries that extensive. This tragedy was kept an official state secret for more than 20 years afterward. Even Bondarenko's fellow squad members, men who had trained beside him, eaten meals with him, and considered him a friend, learned the full details of what had actually happened only by chance. Years, and sometimes decades later, through fragments of information and rumor rather than any official acknowledgement. The Soviet space program was, at that very moment, preparing to triumphantly and publicly send a man into space for the entire world to celebrate, and simultaneously, quietly, hiding the death of its own youngest and perhaps most promising candidate, so that absolutely nothing could overshadow the coming propaganda victory. Think, for a moment, about the psychological weight that Gagarin and the rest of the squad must have carried in those final 20 days, preparing for the single most historic flight in human history, rehearsing every procedure, checking every system, all while knowing that a close comrade had just died in agony during a routine exercise, and that they were absolutely forbidden from speaking about it, even to each other, even in private, beyond Nelyubov, Kardashev, Varlamov, and Bondarenko. Other names gradually and quietly disappeared from the official roster of the first squad, one after another, over the following years. Ivan Anikiev and Valentin Filatyev, the same two men involved in that fateful patrol incident alongside Nelyubov, were also formally expelled in 1963, their careers ending on that same single night. Mars Rafikov left the program even earlier, in 1962, for reasons that remain somewhat murky even to historians who have studied the archives closely. Dmitry Zykin lasted the longest of all the unlucky ones. He wasn't finally dismissed until 1969, after years of otherwise solid service, due to health problems that gradually disqualified him from active flight status. What do all of these men have in common, beyond simple bad timing? After being dismissed from the cosmonaut squad, each of them essentially vanished from public life, as though a door had quietly closed behind them and been sealed shut. There were no interviews, no retrospective articles, no mentions in the Soviet press acknowledging that these men had spent years of their young lives training, at real physical risk to themselves, to become humanity's first explorers of space. The Soviet propaganda machine operated according to a simple, almost brutally consistent principle. There are victorious heroes, and their stories are told in loving, exhaustive detail for generations. And then there are those who never quite made it, and about them, officially, nothing at all is said. For decades, these names existed only in classified archives, buried under layers of state secrecy, known only to a small circle of officials and to the men's own families, who were often themselves unsure of exactly what had happened or why. Only after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, when archives slowly began opening up to researchers and journalists, did space historians finally begin painstakingly reconstructing the complete, honest story of the first squad, piecing it together document by document, interview by interview, including the names and the fates of the men the old system had clearly preferred to forget entirely. It might seem, at this point, like this harsh and often unforgiving price of the space race was a uniquely Soviet phenomenon, a product of one particular political system's obsession with a flawless public image. But take a look at America's own Mercury program, on the opposite side of the Cold War divide, and you'll find a remarkably similar picture underneath all the different rhetoric. Deke Slayton, one of the celebrated original 7 American astronauts of the Mercury program, completed the entire grueling training regimen alongside men like John Glenn and the other legendary figures of that era. He was, by all accounts, fully qualified, fully prepared, and next in line for a flight of his own. But just weeks before his scheduled mission, routine medical testing revealed a minor cardiac arrhythmia, a small, largely inconsequential irregularity in his heartbeat that would likely never have caused him any real trouble in ordinary life. It didn't matter. Slayton was immediately and completely grounded, pulled from flight status, not permanently in the end, but for what turned out to be an extraordinarily long stretch of time. He waited 13 years for his chance to finally reach space. 13 years of watching his own colleagues, men he'd trained beside and considered equals, fly to space one after another while he himself remained on the ground, working instead as a coordinator and manager for other people's missions, helping select and prepare the very astronauts who got to do what he couldn't. Only in 1975, at the age of 51, considerably older than any of his original Mercury classmates had been at launch, did Slayton finally make it into space himself. Fittingly, during the historic joint Soviet-American Apollo-Soyuz mission that symbolically brought the two rival space programs together. This reveals, in the end, the central and perhaps most sobering truth underlying the entire space race on both sides of the Iron Curtain. No matter which flag a program flew, no matter which ideology it claimed to serve, the price of its public triumphs was always paid, quietly and off camera, by dozens of capable, dedicated people whose names never once rang out across the world the way the winners' names did. Let's return, one final time, to the photograph we started with. 6 young men, smiling, full of hope, the year 1960 stretching out in front of them like an open runway. We're used to thinking of the space race as the story of one genius, one rocket, one singular hero whose name every child on the planet can recite without a second thought. But in truth, it was always the story of a dozen people, at minimum. People chosen not by some grand and meaningful design of fate, but by medical commissions and clinical charts, by centrifuge readings and the depth of a particular lake on a particular afternoon. People whose entire difference from Gagarin was measured not in raw talent or courage, because by every account, they had plenty of both, but in bruises on a back after a spinning machine, an unlucky dive into shallow water, a single bad night with a military patrol, or nothing more than simple, indifferent coincidence. Gagarin became an immortal name, recognized on every continent, taught in every history class. And the men who stood right beside him in that very same lineup, in that very same photograph, existed for decades afterward as ghosts of the official record. People the system found it far easier to quietly erase than to ever honestly explain. Next time you come across that famous photograph of the first Soviet cosmonaut squad, take a moment to look more closely at the faces standing slightly further back, slightly less in focus. Behind each and every one of them is a story that someone, somewhere, once worked very hard to make sure you would never hear. If this story got to you, subscribe to the channel, because we've got plenty more forgotten pages of history just like this one, waiting to be told. Hit like if you want more deep dives like this one, and let us know in the comments which forgotten historical figure you think we should cover next.